Hello, welcome to another one of my Alteryx videos. This video has two purposes. One is to solve a sometimes vexing problem, and second, trying to get you to expand out your knowledge of Alteryx and look at some of the parameters and options available to you, as well as understanding how Alteryx works and caches information within its workflows. Put together, these will make our life easier. So the direct problem is that I have multiple worksheets that have my puppy information in them. For example, I have this spreadsheet that came to me from one source. It has some puppies in it. This is my basic puppy information, but I notice it has two tabs in it, or two sheets in it. This sheet is slightly different than the first sheet in the fact that it has coat color, which is something I'm not all that concerned about. And then I have a second spreadsheet of puppy information, and this one has in it also the breed size. So these data sets aren't quite the same, and I want to be able to continue to process these spreadsheets day over day from the different source systems without having to worry about matching everything up and editing and modifying my workflow for every single spreadsheet that I get. So we close these out because remember that when Alteryx is trying to read a spreadsheet, if you have it open, it'll give you an error. So what we want to look at, not only solving this problem, but looking at a few easy ways to help make your life more simple. And that is, first of all, you need to understand that macros can do some things that standard workflows can't. And so even if you don't necessarily need a macro as far as repeatability, you do get better performance out of it in certain circumstances so that you don't have to do some really deep programming. Second item we want to bring out is exploring the configuration options. A lot of times you just take the basic configurations within a widget without looking at all of the configuration options and what they might mean to you. So we're going to look at some of those that you might not actually notice to begin with. And it's good to understand how Alteryx can process your data and use that processing as far as how it caches information and other features to your advantage to make this process simpler. And again, putting all this together, this complex problem of having multiple tabs in multiple spreadsheets with multiple formats actually will allow us to very simply build a workflow to solve this problem. So one thing I want to highlight is when we talk about all the different options, Alteryx has hidden some things from you that you might not otherwise see. So for example, within parse, I have text to columns, in case you haven't seen this and haven't watched my other videos. Its name is text to columns. It just so happens that there's a configuration option that allows you, rather than split it to columns, you can split it to rows. Why Alteryx doesn't have two widgets, one for text to column and one for text to rows, I don't know, but it's good to understand that this one widget has two different operations that make it useful to you. So what do we want to do? Well, as you saw, we have multiple spreadsheets. They have a common naming, and I want to bring all those worksheets in my directory and process them without having to individually name them. Alteryx has done a wonderful job since their instantiation of creating all kinds of things that you need. So for example, up here, if you look at this, you see we have this directory widget. And I'm going to go ahead and copy in the one that we're going to use for this just because it keeps it easier, so I don't have to go ahead and configure it, but we'll talk about the configuration. So let's go ahead and paste it in here. There we go, directory specification that we want. This actually returns a list of files. There's a lot of reasons you might want to use this, but the basic one is to deal with something that's much more dynamic. Within it, we only have two parameters actually, and one checkbox, and it is the directory, which is my Daisy Hill directory, which has all my files in it. And the second one is a file specification. In this case, we're going to look at those files that start with test puppy, have something else after them, and it's a spreadsheet. We do not want to look in subdirectory, something else we can do. So we go ahead and very quickly go to favorites, drop a select onto here, and you see that a whole wealth of information is returned to you from this directory. We don't need any of it except for this full path name. We'll go into options, select, deselect all, click our full path name, run this, And you see down here that we have those two spreadsheets that we want to deal with. Well, this is just the name of the spreadsheets. What's inside of those spreadsheets? What tabs are inside of there? Well, it turns out that Alteryx has the ability to do that as well. It can tell you the tabs that are inside of a worksheet. And to utilize this to our advantage, since we don't know what's coming in, we want some standard processing, we're going to go ahead and use a macro to do this work with us. So let's go ahead and open up the macro that I developed for this example. It is the createSpreadsheetFilenameWithSheet macro. Very simply, you give it a name of a spreadsheet, and it goes ahead and uses one of the other options. If you look at your input for a spreadsheet, one of the things you have in a table or query is to request in this box a list of sheet names. And then what kind of information do you want? Well, in this case, I want the full path of that name as well. So if I actually run this, and so when you're creating a macro, you need to go ahead and make sure it works as a standalone, and you do that by having a what I call a stub input in certain cases. So this is a spreadsheet just want to use in order to run this. What we do from there is we go ahead and set the data types for sheet name and file name, and then we also will do a macro that gives us the format of the spreadsheet and sheet name that can be passed into an input widget in order to read that. And finally, we select just out the new data and go. So we can run this without being processed in, and you can see that for this file, we go ahead and let's make this a little bit bigger down here. So grabbing it, you see that the full format of that name is the file name, 3 up and down lines, which is the straight connector line, and then the name of the sheet. So this way we can directly address what Alteryx would use from an input widget by having the file name 3 straight lines and the sheet name. You can find this out through exploration by looking at what you can do as far as modifying it. Look at the data that's involved within the definition of the configuration of the input widget to find this format. Nice to know it's right here. So then all I want to do is send that back, and this will be able to be passed directly into an input widget so that it will find just that spreadsheet and that sheet. So what we want to do in our workflow then is simply come over here and insert that macro. Down here, macros, here's one we're talking about. Drop that up here. Make it look pretty. Drop a browse on the end of it so we can see the values coming out. Run this. Well, gotta go ahead and configure it. Select a field, file name. There's only one there. Why doesn't it know it by default? Don't know, but it reminds us we need to do it. So we look at the output and we can see the same thing. Here we have the file name with first, second, and third spreadsheets tabs. So passing this in dynamically into an input macro will go ahead and give us the information that we need. Now you might say, what about the dynamic input macro that's up here? It's in developer. The dynamic input will work, except for the problem that if we use this in order to go ahead and bring our input in, it will give us an error because the format is not the same. Trust me, it does that. Tried it. It won't work. This is where a macro comes into play, because a macro has the ability to override that little problem. So we'll drop this out a little bit longer and we'll look at another macro that we've done. So if we open up my other macro that I use with this, which is inputMultipleSheets, we'll take a look at it very briefly as to what it does. If you notice, it's very simple. The stub of this is that it just simply reads an Excel spreadsheet in and sends the output out. But what we want to do is go ahead and bring in the spreadsheet input name, go ahead and modify with the action the full name of the file, which is what we've created, which is the full file name plus the 3 straight lines, followed by the sheet name, and that will read those in. Since this is an iterative process, in our example that we're doing today, we'll be sending in 3 different spreadsheet sheets and they will be sent to the output. Now, as you notice, they all have a slightly different format. We want to send back all of those fields, not just a common set of fields, and we definitely do want it to error out. The way that we do that is another parameter here in interface design. You're familiar with the interface design when you're working with interactive, but it applies to this as well. In the properties, you see that by default, this is what it looks like. All iterations will have the same output. What we're going to do is show you how that works very quickly, because that is the default and that actually gives us an error. We'll save this, come back to our workflow, we will insert this macro that we've been working on, which is input multiple spreadsheets. We'll drop it in the middle here. We have to give it a control parameter, which is the file name. And then there is our output. So if we run this with our 3 different spreadsheet tabs, you'll get the error that the output has changed between iterations, which will fail this work. It actually will only send back the first iteration, which doesn't do us any good. But if we go back into the configuration through the interface designer, configuration, we click on auto configure by name. It waits until it's done. This might slow it down a little bit, but not really. Save this one more time. Come back to our workflow. It reminds us that it's changed. We'll use the new one. Now if we run it, you see that it ran through cleanly. Since we would really like to see a few more details, we also want to talk about the configuration of this workflow. Clicking on the white space, go into configuration at runtime and say show all macro messages. This gives us a little bit more information about what's running. It says 2 iterations were run of the first macro, 3 iterations were run with the second macro. So everything looked pretty good. Not a whole lot of information, but if you have an error, it'll pinpoint where the error is. So that's a good option to turn on. So now we have this data that has fields in it that we don't need. We want to put them into our database. So the first thing that we needed to know is that bringing down the output data, go ahead and choosing our MySQL for the output, giving it our name. I'm going to go ahead and cut and paste this just because I don't want to make any errors and there's no validation or other input options available. So I've already created this table and you'll see why in a minute. It is currently empty. Click on the quoted to none, which is an option I always like to do. You'll notice that option 4 here says append field map by field name. This is available or will be exercised if you're appending to an existing table. So we want to go ahead and choose that option. We go into the append field map by clicking on the 3 dots or the ellipse. And you see that it brings us up a list of the workflow fields and columns within the table. We want to click on custom mapping, so we'll actually use this mapping that is here. You'll notice that for coat color and breed size, it automatically sets itself to none. We click OK. We run this. And you'll see that the data goes in there cleanly. Now you will probably run into a problem if you're not running your workflows as you add additional widgets. A lot of times you just sort of like to run them all and to try to run it at the end to see what happens. And in that case, this won't quite work the same way. You can see here, if we look at this, 300 records were written to it. Everything worked fine. But what happens if you don't get that nice little mapping in there? So what we'll do is I'll show you very quickly is that if I copy all of this out, put it into a new workflow, click on my output here, click on my custom, you will see this as the problem. So what you have to do when you get ready to do this is to run it through your workflow once. The easiest way is simply not to have the output, as you saw us do. Let's cancel this out. Right click and hit cut. Now we can run this workflow. You see things worked. We'll paste that exact same widget back in again, connect it up, and you see now that we go into the custom, it has populated the way we need it to. So that's understanding how the Alteryx workflow will store within itself knowledge about what is going on and allow you to get it to do the job that you need it to. So the question always asked as we get rid of this is, well, what happens when I run this the next time, because it doesn't know about those fields in that mapping. So without actually changing our workflow at all that we're going to do is go into our spreadsheets and make a slight change to them. So what we have in our spreadsheets is we had our test puppy 1 and test puppy 2. We're going to rename test puppy 2 to old. And I created a second test puppy 2, and we'll rename that just to test puppy. Open that up very briefly, and you can see I added a second tab in there, or a second sheet that has this extra column on it. If all works well, this column will not cause us problems. It will simply be ignored, and the answer is yes, it will ignore it, because through the dynamic field processing or unknown field processing that Alteryx can handle, it will simply add it into the do not map column of this. So simply running it here, you can see now we have 301 records because we had 4 iterations. You see we get no error because it's appending those columns the same way and ignoring the additional column that we had in it. So this way it can run over and over again without ever having to be modified, simply by adding new spreadsheets into our directory. It will read them. So the next step in this process, that is going to be the subject of another video, is to how to make this so that it's iterative, which means that every day it simply reads new spreadsheets, doesn't read all the spreadsheets. And the answer is you can do that as well. And we'll talk about that in my next video to deal with your multiple spreadsheets as well as your day-over-day processing. If you have any questions about how I built these workflows, please drop me a comment, subscribe. Let me know whether you liked this or didn't like this, how well it helped you. Let me know questions, and stay tuned for future videos. Have a great day.